This time lapse is going to show you in 8 minutes all of the plastic modifications I did to the Lancer class pursuit craft. In reality, this took about 45 minutes to do all of the plastic cutting. The first thing I'm going to do is use flush cutters to remove the tabs that hold on the engine nacelle nozzles, as well as the posts underneath the engine nacelle itself that kind of fuse the top half and the bottom half together. This is going to allow me to actually bind both the top and the bottom halves of the chassis together, and then use a drill bit to clear out a hole where an LED is going to stick out from. But first, to prevent those things from interfering with the drilling, I actually have to remove those pieces of plastic. Before I join the top and bottom halves back together to drill out the engine nacelles, I want to remove a few of those connecting posts first. The reason why is because the plastic is going to be in the way of some of the electronics. So the first thing is I'm going to remove the forward posts for the microcontroller and then remove the rear posts. Now with that rotary tightening tool, you have to be really careful. If you look, I've made a small little hole there. In this case, what I'm going to do is actually lean into the mistake and clear out those ventral vents. And the reason why is because I can point an LED to shine out the back and fill in the gaps that I'm creating with the disc cutter with some super glue, which will dry white and give it kind of this nice white lensing effect. Now that I've removed the posts, it's going to be easy for me to put it back together and tear it apart. But for the drilling, I actually want to bind both the top and the bottom halves together using the engine housing, which will actually hold the final assembly of the model together. This holds both the top and the bottom half together, and then I can take a drill bit and go through each of the engine nacelles without worrying about centering the drill bit or trying to cut through basically half of the plastic, and that could make it really uneven. So that gives me a nice even drill, and unfortunately that hole is not quite wide enough for an LED. So the next thing is that I have to take the grinding tool, and this is kind of a conical grinding tool, which will kind of be the main thing that I use for most of the rest of the plastic modifications, and widen the holes until the LED fits. But I also want to be careful that it's not so wide that the engine nozzles are smaller than the holes that are created. That'll cause a lot of light to leak out, which could be kind of a cool effect, but I think it looks a little bit sloppy. So you'll see that there's going to be a lot of trying to test and fit to make sure that everything assembles correctly and that the holes are centered and are the correct size. It's always best to go slow and with a very little amount of pressure with that grinding tool. Don't hold it on the plastic for too long, otherwise you might create a divot which will catch the blade, and then basically you'll find yourself gouging the plastic in ways that you didn't want to. One thing I did forget was to actually remove the posts on the top half of the chassis. So I can start it with the flush cutters, but then I found that it's probably best to use a more precise tool like that grinding tool and angle it in so that I can remove more of the plastic without trying not to damage the engine nacelles themselves. In the final fitting for the LED, I want the wide part of the base of the lens to not stick out of the engine nacelle, but the narrow part of the lens to stick out of the nacelle and fit inside of the nozzle. Last thing is I do need to take some super glue, and in this case I'm using really thick Gorilla Glue gel to fill in those gaps, and that gel will form the lens, and I'll let that dry completely before continuing to work on the ship. The LEDs inside of the engine nacelles do have to be wired to the main body. And I'm not using magnet wire to hook up those LEDs. I'm actually using insulated wire. So I'll have to remove some of the plastic to create a little bit of a channel on each of the nacelle. And that channel is going to have to be cut to both the bottom and the top. Now, when you're doing so, it's nice to use a reference point to make sure that you're actually cutting both sides, both the top and the bottom halves at the exact same location. That'll allow insulated wire to fit through. The plastic is thick, but it's not as thick as you think it is, so be very, very careful. Because I do want some additional fiber optic lights near the engine nacelles that are going to be white kind of operating or running lights, I do need to remove a few more of those smaller plastic posts, which have already broken, and they don't really do much for the integrity of the ship anyway. Now time for the tiny drill bit. I'm going to go ahead and drill in essentially 4 fiber optic dots per targeting arc. In this case, what I'd like to do is kind of pick where they're going to sit and work from the center for each of those dots and then work my way outward. So a left one and a right one across the back, and then an outer left one and an outer right one across the back. After I've done that, then I can pick a similar location on the front of the ship and drill those in as well. So therefore, I've tried to make them as parallel as possible by working from the inside and going towards the outside. It's a little easier than just trying to go straight across. Um, so after I've done that, the next thing I want to do is actually cut in or drill in some headlights into the front near the cockpit. And I'm drilling them in at a different angle. Basically, while the fiber optics for the arc indicators go up, I'm actually going to go uh, in front of the cockpits because I want the lights to kind of point out and have the fiber optics go in a different direction. Next, I'm going to use the horizontal marks to drill in the left and right targeting indicators and try to make those as parallel as possible. In order to make it to where I can push down on the turret and have it be a little button that changes the indicated arc, I actually need to pop out that turret first. Now that turret's going to be glued onto a button, so I'm cutting off the legs of the turret so that I can glue it onto the button. And you can see that that is a tiny, what's called a tactile push button switch. Now that switch is approximately the size of essentially the little tabs or the slots where the turret fit in. So I'll use that as a reference guide for cutting the hole that's going to accommodate the button itself. The hole, it's going to be a square hole, but we actually have to start with a round tool. So I'm cutting a pilot hole with just a regular drill bit, and then I'll use the grinding tool to widen and shape it into a square or more square hole. The funny thing about any sort of subtractive machining using rotary tools, a friend of mine works in a machine shop, and he tells me that there's really no such thing in rotary machine tooling as a square hole. That's pretty much what you'd have to use a laser cutter for. Now, I work left to right so that I can actually hit those points that were indicated by the slots where the turret went in. But you'll notice that after I do that, I very carefully work my way outwards and make that square hole. And each time I make a little bit of a change, I try to see exactly how much further I need to go before the button will fit in from the bottom. Earlier, I neglected to put in those extra running lights, so I'm going from the inside out for this one since it's hard to figure out where kind of the horizontal plastic is. And it's a good thing that I removed those two posts because it would be really hard to try to thread fiber optics around them. Because there's not enough room inside of the chassis for all the electronics and a battery, I'm going to attach a battery to a base. And to make that happen, I actually need to have this little pigtail come through the body of the ship. And I'll talk a little bit more about the pigtail later on. It's called the JST-PH connector. But once again, I'm going to use the drill to make a pilot hole where I think I want that little pigtail to go. And then I'll use the grinder to make that hole more rectangular. It's best to work very slowly. I know that the time-lapse makes it go quick, but this process took almost about 10 minutes to slowly grind out the hole. And I do multiple fittings to make sure that I haven't gone too far. And if I do it just right, then the pigtail will be nice and snug. And if you make it a little bit too wide, there's always green stuff that you can use to kind of patch and fill. So final fitting shows me that the electronics fit nicely along where the pigtail enters the body.